There are not many images from the Puritan poets, no photographs, of course, but the private nature of poetry in 17th century New England meant no portraits were made either. The fame of our earliest poets would not be recognized in their own time. This 19th century engraving is one of very few. A North Andover home, the characteristic salt box shape of its time, the home of Anne Bradstreet, built in 1667 when Anne was in her mid-50s. Here was amassed the library of English books collected by her husband, Simon Bradstreet, governor of the colony. Welcome to English 3350, a survey of American literature before the Civil War. We're in Studio 3 at the M.D. Anderson Library on the main campus of the University of Houston. I'm Barry Wood, and today we're looking at the poets, Puritan poets, the first true literary artists of American literature, and specifically Anne Bradstreet and Edward Taylor. Anne Bradstreet was born Anne Dudley in Northampton, England in 1612. Her mother is lost to history. Her father, Thomas Dudley, was an orphan at age 10. He served as a soldier under Queen Elizabeth I, and he was, by persuasion, a nonconformist, that is, a Puritan in his sympathies. After serving for Queen Elizabeth, he served as a steward for the Earl of Lincoln, and in the Earl of Lincoln's household was a young man by the name of Simon Bradstreet, also an orphan. He'd been orphaned at age 14, a very educated and literate man. He had earned a bachelor's and a master's degree. The residence, truly a castle that the Earl of Lincoln lived in, was a very congenial, almost aristocratic environment for this young girl to grow up in. And the young steward, Simon Bradstreet, who replaced Thomas Dudley, fell in love with Anne Bradstreet, and they were married in 1628. She was age 16, he was age 25. 2 years later, in 1630, they sailed for the New World. Both Anne and her husband and her parents. It was the very first ship to go out to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Arabella sailed from Northampton, and so they heard that farewell sermon by John Cotton talking about the taking of the land in the New World. They also heard John Winthrop's sermon aboard the ship, a model of Christian charity. So she was among those who came to America to establish a kingdom of God on earth, to found a new Canaan, and as they believed, to finally reform the Christian religion after 15 centuries of what they felt was a corrupt church. Anne's intellectual background is very much an educated one. Her father's service under Queen Elizabeth made this young woman fully conversant with issues to do with royalty and the English aristocracy. Her father's position then as as steward to the Earl of Lincoln gave her access to an excellent library. And her poetry, especially her early poetry, reveals very much her learning. And what she had not picked up in England as a girl, she certainly added to it in New England. Her husband and father brought up substantial collections of books. And so she was an educated young woman, and she continued her education. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, here's a map. Massachusetts Bay Colony really covers most of present-day Massachusetts. Some of the major settlements are marked, of course. Plymouth down here near Cape Cod Bay, Boston, Cambridge, which today, of course, is within the city limits of Boston itself. Cambridge is where Harvard University is located. Salem, which we'll be looking at next day in connection with the witchcraft trials, and Andover and Ipswich are certainly major coastal colonies, and of course Westfield back in the wilderness here at Hartford, Connecticut, down here. In these colonies that are marked were all homes for Anne Bradstreet. In 1630 they landed at Salem, and within very few months they had moved to Boston and then to Cambridge, which in those days was called Newtown, and then they moved up to Ipswich on the coast, and then in 1638 they moved to Andover, and that's where she lived for the duration of her life. Thomas Dudley, her father, became the governor of this whole colony, and in turn her husband, Simon Bradstreet, became governor. So they were certainly at the center of political power. In 1647, her brother-in-law, the Reverend John Woodbridge, made a trip to England, and he took with him a manuscript collection of Anne Bradstreet's poetry. And in 1650, her poetry was published in England under the title The 10th Muse. Here's a sample of her handwriting. This would be what her brother-in-law carried to England. It's hard to read. He that is to sail into a far country. You can puzzle it out if you take time. But here are her major publications. The 10th Muse was published in 1650 in England. The 10th Muse lately sprung up in America. The Muses, of course, the 9 Muses are the female deities that inspire poetry and art in ancient Greek mythology. And so this title casts Anne Bradstreet as the 10th Muse, lately sprung up in America. And we need to emphasize here that this was done without her permission. In fact, when she saw the book, she was quite shocked that this had happened. She had certainly not written with the idea of publishing her poetry, and she didn't think it was good enough. But she did revise extensively over the years, and you'll see that in 1678 a revised edition of her poetry was brought out, several poems compiled with great variety of wit and learning. You'll notice the dates. This is posthumous. So the only copy of her poetry that she saw during her lifetime was the 10th Muse. And had it not been for that enterprising brother-in-law, perhaps her poetry would not have seen the light of day. There's a prologue that she wrote, and it captures very much the way she sees herself as an artist. To sing of wars, of captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun, for my meaned pen are two superior things, or how they all or each their dates have run, let poets and historians set these forth. My obscure lines shall not so dim their worth. A phrase like my mean pen in the third line, or my obscure lines in the sixth line, clearly indicate her sense that she really cannot, she doesn't feel compete on the artistic stage. The two other lines there, lines 11 and 12, a Bartos can do what a Bartos will, but simple I, according to my skill. The name Bartos there refers to Guillaume de Sallust du Bartos, a French poet who was very much admired by the Puritans, and he had actually died 22 years before Anne Bradstreet was born, but he was particularly attractive to the Puritans because he wrote long religious epics, and you could see that that sort of epic quality has affected Anne Bradstreet in the way she begins this poem, to sing of wars, of captains, and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun. That's very much in the mode of the kind of thing that Bartos wrote. But she says she can only write according to her skill. She is certainly no Guillaume de Bartos. She goes on. My foolish, broken, blemished muse so sings, and this to mend, alas, no art is able, 'cause nature made it so irreparable. Again, very self-deprecating. There's a kind of pleasant humility about this woman. She didn't intend to publish her poems. She clearly thought they weren't good enough. But then, as we move a little further into the poem, we sense her spirit of independence and her self-assertiveness coming out. She says, I am obnoxious to each carping tongue. Probably the meaning of obnoxious there is oblivious. I am oblivious to each carping tongue. Or, in other words, she's trying to ignore them. Who says my hand a needle better fits. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong, for such despite they cast on female wits. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance. So here we have lines that capture very much the attitudes of her day. Women certainly are not regarded as literary artists, and women should probably be at home doing housewifely things. A needle better fits. They do not have the talent for art. These are all attitudes that seem to lie behind these words. And even if she does happen to do rather well in her poetry, if what I do prove well, they'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance. So she feels that the male artists of her time will rationalize her success. But she goes on. Let Greeks be Greeks, and women what they are. Men have precedency and still excel. One senses that she, even though she may be champing a bit against the domination of the male, she doesn't really want to completely upset things. She acknowledges that men have a superior position in society, that they have precedency, they are preeminent. She lives in a time when it is a man's world, and she acknowledges that. She doesn't seem to want to break too much with that. There's just a slight touch of rebellion in what she says. It is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best, and women know it well. Preeminence in all, and each is yours. And then the little question at the end, or the little statement at the end, the assertion of herself, yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. And towards the end of the poem, then, there's a little bit of irony comes out. She says, give time or parsley wreaths, I ask no bays. The bay refers to the laurel, which is the traditional, I guess, shrub that is used to make laurel wreaths, used to honor poets since ancient Greek times. She doesn't ask for laurel. She says, give thyme or parsley wreaths. And, of course, there's irony there because thyme and parsley are kitchen herbs. They're the sort of thing that a woman would use in cooking. This mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold but more to shine. An interesting conclusion here that if her poetry isn't too good, well, gentlemen, it will make yours look even better. Now, as I said, she was rather chagrined over the publication of the 10th Muse, and for a time she really did lack confidence in her early poetry, despite the fact that there's 200 pages of pretty substantial poetry. A lot of it, of course, is imitative of Barthes and earlier writers. She has a kind of epic sweep and a lot of learning and so on. But it did show a lot of poetic power and a lot of learning. She certainly knew her history, and it showed in her poetry. But now she sets about to fix it. Because now that it's in print, she could see its flaws. And this little poem was written sometime after the publication of the 10th Muse. This poem did not see the light of day until the second edition in 1668. The genius of this little poem is that she personifies her book as a child, an offspring. Very appropriate for a mother with children. And she sustains this comparison through the full poem. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true. Referring, of course, to her brother-in-law making off with her offspring, her poetry. Who thee abroad, you have to understand a verb there, who took thee abroad, exposed to public view. Here's her offspring, not only taken away from her, but exposed to public view, made thee in rags, halting to the press to trudge. In terms of the personification of the book as a child, whoever took this child has got it dressed in rags. Not too nice a way to have your child displayed. But of course the rags is a nice reference here to the cloth binding that a hardbound book has. Where errors were not lessened, all may judge. And if you think again of that handwriting, even though quite legible, nevertheless, that's what the publishers had to work with in setting up the type. And since they only had her brother-in-law in London to go to deal with, if they couldn't read a word or weren't sure of a word, then an error could easily creep in. And incidentally, in early printing, there were a lot of errors. modern typesetting, particularly in the last 10 years or so with the computer, has made it possible to virtually eliminate errors. If the manuscript is worked over and corrected, then it can be scanned in and it's virtually error-free. But the setting of type by each letter being set individually meant that even if a manuscript was correct, that errors could creep in. So now that it's published with all its errors, she has to deal with it. Yet, being mine, after all, it is her child, even though she's embarrassed by it and didn't really want to acknowledge the book for some time. Yet, being mine, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runst more hobbling than is meet. The suggestion here is that this offspring is born a little misshapen. Maybe one leg is a little longer than the other, but she has stretched the joints to even out the feet. And, of course, the feet has a double reference. She's referring here to the metrical feet of the poem. Yet even so, she says, it hobbles along. She's not entirely satisfied that the meter works as well as it could. Finally, always carrying through this personification very, very nicely, she says, if for thy father asked, speaking to her book, if you're asked who your father is, say thou hadst none, and for thy mother she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. Well, the success of that poem, it seems to me, is the sustaining of the personification. In fact, often that's the key to a poem. If a personification or a particular device is used, if that is sustained and there's no lapse, and it's done cleverly, then often that in itself will make the poem successful. A comparison, however, that's dropped partway through will often make a particular poem falter. It's something to look for, not just in Anne Bradstreet's poetry, but in other poems too. What her brother-in-law did, he really put before the world the first woman poet of America. But he did more than that. He put before the public the first woman poet in the English language. I was thinking about this, and I wondered if it was really the case, and I pulled down my English Literature Anthology, Volume 1, and looked through, and indeed, there is not a single woman poet or writer in English literature of any, certainly not in the selections in the anthologies, of any substance in the whole period before Anne Bradstreet. So she is not only the first in American literature, she is the first poet in America. Hers is the first book of poetry written by someone living in America. And perhaps with the exception of, the single exception of the Greek poet Sappho, she appears to be the first woman poet in all of Europe. It's perhaps something to celebrate in a language 600 years old, as the English language was at this time, that the first woman poet was nurtured on American soil. Here's what Woodbridge, her brother-in-law, wrote in the preface to the 10th Muse. Very conscious, of course, that the public, not being used to poetry written by women or literature of any kind written by women, would be surprised. He wrote, "It is the work of a woman honored and esteemed where she lives for her gracious demeanor, her pious conversation, her courteous disposition, her exact diligence in her place, and discreet managing of her family occasions. And more than so, these poems are the fruit but of some hours curtailed from her sleep and other refreshments." Just in case someone is likely to be critical of a woman writing poetry when, after all, she should be busy in the kitchen and bringing up children, he makes it very clear that she is a discreet manager of her family, and that writing these poems was not done by taking away from her family or her children. It was done by loss of sleep and other refreshments. If we ask why women produced so little in the way of literature until recent times, you only need one woman poet of this talent to indicate that women are as capable of writing literature as men. I think there's a simple, single answer. It takes leisure. And as men constructed a world through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which finally created the possibility of leisure, the men also built a world where the leisure accrued principally to man. Women didn't experience any of that leisure until much more recently. And indeed, it's interesting, in English literature, we have to come from the 17th century all the way up to the 19th century with women like Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Christina Rossetti. And we have to come all the way up to the 19th century to Emily Dickinson, another 2 centuries before we get more poetry by women. Though we have to remark that there were a few scattered women writers in the 18th century in America, not in England. Well, the mention of her family and so on brings us to another side of Anne Bradstreet, and that is her family life. She raised 8 children, and this poem is written with a kind of background theme of death. And the Puritans, we need to keep in mind, they believed very literally in the Bible that the death was the sentence that God had given to humanity. In line 5, which is not on the screen, the sentence passed is most irrevocable. That's the line. The sentence passed is most irrevocable, line 5 of this poem. And what that's referring to is the sentence that was meted out to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden after they sinned. Remember, death came into the world at that point. And the Puritan believed very literally in this. The sentence passed is most irrevocable, so all humanity thereafter lives under this sentence of death. And so she is writing within that framework. And perhaps we need to keep in mind, too, that looking forward to childbirth was always for a woman in colonial times, and certainly earlier than that, as a possibility of death. Death in childbirth was common enough that a woman coming up to childbirth always faced that possibility. And the title of this poem, too, provides that kind of a context. She is writing before the birth of one of her children. And here the lines, "How soon, my dear, death may my steps attend, how soon it may be thy lot to lose thy friend." That covers both the possibility that she might die in childbirth, but also the possibility that she may die while this child is quite young. "And if I see not half my days that's due, what nature would, God grant to yours and you. The many faults that well you know I have, let be interred in my oblivion's grave. If any worth or virtue were in me, let that live freshly in thy memory." So she would like to have her faults buried and her virtues remembered. We do not know much about the day-to-day details of Anne Bradstreet's life. But the evidence of her poetry is that she was supremely happy in her marriage. There are 2 or 3 poems that would suggest this. "To my dear and loving husband, if ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches than the east doth hold. My love is such the rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we live in love, let's so persevere that when we live no more, we may live ever." It's genuine. She's not drawing on a tradition here, given the fact, there are love poems, but prior to her time, they were all written by men. And so a man writing a love poem inevitably would find himself falling into formulas that have been used by others. But I think, given the fact that we don't have any women writing before Anne Bradstreet, we could say that this is perhaps the earliest poem that we could find of a woman writing about her feelings for her husband. And it does bring her very much to life. Puritan she was, certainly very contemplative, very learned, very well read, very thoughtful. But, and her work will stand up intellectually beside the best that's been done in England, certainly in religious poetry. But she was also very much a woman, one who valued her earthly life and daily experiences alongside things spiritual. Here, for instance, is a poem written as a letter to her husband, who is absent upon public employment. He is a few miles to the south, probably in Boston, in connection with his job as governor. "My head, my heart, mine eyes, my life, nay more, my joy, my magazine of earthly store, if two be one as surely thou and I, how stayest thou there, whilst I at Ipswich lie? I like the earth this season, mourn in black. My sun is gone so far in his zodiac, whom whilst I joined, nor storms nor frosts I felt, his warmth such frigid colds did cause to melt." Her husband is here symbolized as a sun, and he's gone so far in the zodiac that line, "like the earth this season, mourn in black," suggests that the leafless black trees of winter. And when we get to the next lines, it's clear by the mention of a Capricorn that the sun is in Capricorn. This is clearly the time of winter. My chilled limbs now numbed lie forlorn. Return, return, sweet Sol from Capricorn. And what she has to comfort her while her husband is gone is her children. And she refers to those as those fruits. But she is really quite unabashed in her phrasing. In this dead time, alas, what can I more than view those fruits which through thy heat I bore? Flesh of thy flesh, bone of thy bone, I here, thou there, yet both but one. Perhaps despite her accomplishments in meditative and contemplative poetry and religious poetry, it may well be that these poems that center on her personal life, her family, her husband, and her children are the poems that distinguish her more than most others. Here's one, for instance. She didn't lose any of her children, her 8 children, but Elizabeth Bradstreet, a grandchild, died at the age of 1.5 years. And here we have a kind of traditional religious consolation. Farewell, dear babe, my heart's too much content. Farewell, sweet babe, the pleasure of mine eye. Farewell, fair flower that for a space was lent, then taken away into eternity. Blessed babe, why should I once bewail thy fate, or sigh thy days so soon were terminate? Sith thou art settled in an everlasting state. That word sith is an older form of since. Why should I bewail thy fate, since you are settled in an everlasting state? And she's falling back then on the Christian idea of an afterlife and eternal reward. This, of course, has been and does remain, I would think today, the principal consolation provided by the Christian belief in the soul's survival after death. We find the same kind of consolation in this poem. In July of 1666, the Bradstreet's house in Andover burned. Virtually everything was lost. A lifetime of books, their possessions, and of course this is one of the most traumatic experiences that humans can endure. She talks in the beginning of the poem in a very dramatic fashion about hearing fire, fire, and she jumps up and walks out, and they stand outside the house and watch the house go up in flames until she can't watch anymore, and she sees all of her possessions going up in smoke. And then towards the end of the poem, this is lines 37 to 46, she comes in with the as I said, traditional sort of religious consolation that we really should not fix our eyes on things of this world. We must raise our eyes. There is another house. Then straight I 'gin my heat to chide, and did thy wealth on earth abide? She's speaking in a sense to God here. Does true wealth live or exist only on earth? Didst fix thy hope on mouldering dust? Raise up thy thoughts above the sky, that dunghill mists away may fly. Thou hast an house on high erect, framed by that mighty architect. With glory richly furnished, stands permanent, though this be fled. There's a kind of house of God that she should be pointing her attention to. Yet, if you read the poem, the consolation that we get in these lines is perhaps not entirely satisfying. The lines preceding it, in which she poignantly talks about her house and goes through the ruins and talks about, here's where my trunk sat and here's where this sat, and so on, and sort of itemizes, seems to deal very realistically with the hardship of ordinary human life with an intense sense of reality. The religion that is brought in these later lines of the poems seem to be a kind of doctrinal solution to the problems that human beings have on earth, but it does not entirely set aside the earthly and very earthy emotions which she writes of so well. And in that sense, she doesn't seem to be as entirely wrapped in her Puritan theology as many other writers. She will, when needed, pull out a doctrinal Puritan Christian solution to a problem, but she can't quite repress the things of this world. Not that she is too overly devoted to them either. It's simply that she does live very balanced between the two. Her greatest accomplishment in terms of religious poetry is perhaps Contemplations, which is a long 33-stanza poem. I didn't put it on the readings. It's in the anthology. A long meditative lyric which shows the influence of Edmund Spenser and so on. But this little poem is a rather interesting one. The Flesh and the Spirit. If you read this carefully, you'll see that this is a debate. It's a debate between twin sisters. One is called Flesh and one is called Spirit. Flesh gets to speak at these lines that are on the screen at line 9, and she speaks 27 lines, that is up to line 36, and states the position on things according to flesh, that is the bodily position on living in this world. And then Spirit answers from line 37 to the end of the poem, and this, of course, is almost 3 times as long, some 70 lines. Sister, quoth Flesh, speaking to Spirit, what livest thou on? Nothing but meditation? Doth contemplation feed thee so, regardlessly to let earth go? Can speculation satisfy notion without reality? Notion here means idea or thought. Can speculation satisfy ideas without reality? Are ideas without the real world enough? That means, do you dream of things beyond the moon, and dost thou hope to dwell there soon? This might be the sort of language that a skeptic about the spiritual world would put forward. But then the clearly superior part here, could we bring that up a little bit larger on the screen? The superior part speaks and speaks to flesh, spirit. Be still, thou unregenerate part. Spirit here is speaking to the body. Disturb no more my settled heart. For I have vowed, and so will do, thee as a foe still to pursue. So spirit regards the body as an enemy. And combat with thee will and must until I see thee laid in the dust. Sisters we are, yea, twins we be, yet deadly feud twixt thee and me. A good description of the sort of eternal war waged between spirit and flesh. And here, perhaps to translate these into more contemporary terms, we need to think of spirit as partially mind, aspiration, maybe conscience. The equivalent experience is perhaps for the person who feels pulled in two directions. Their mind says, no, don't do that, don't waste time, don't drink so much, don't smoke so much, don't run around so much. And of course, that's the conscience pulling back, whereas the body is pulled in the other directions, tempted, so to speak. It's the same sort of struggle, though it is seen in 17th century as a struggle between the body and the spirit or the soul. And here spirit is still speaking, for from one Father are we not. Thou by old Adam wast begot. That is, the body is the inherited physical body that is descended from Adam, the physical man. But my arise, Spirit says, is from above, whence my dear Father I do love. Again, this is more or less standard Christian doctrine, that the body is of the earth, whereas the spirit is from heaven. But spirit, of course, has often found herself enslaved by the body. How oft thy slave hast thou me made, when I believed what thou hast said, and never had more cause of woe than when I did what thou badst do. So spirit is somewhat resentful of the pull and the temptations that body has had on her. Then she answers very directly the body's questions to her. How do I live? Thou needst not scoff, for I have meat thou knowest not of. The hidden manna I do eat. The word of life, it is my meat. My thoughts do yield me more content than can thy hours in pleasure spent. Mine eye doth pierce the heavens and see what is invisible to thee. My garments are no silk nor gold, nor such like trash which earth doth hold. And so she answers. Not only presents her own vision of things, but answers flesh, saying that she really has a higher reality. And then, as if to prove the point, Spirit moves into a visionary section around line 85, a vision of the heavenly city. The city where I hope to dwell, there's none on earth can parallel. And if you read those lines fully, 25 lines in the poem, you might recognize that the imagery is drawn very much from the description of the heavenly city as found in the last book of the Bible, Revelations, the final chapter, chapter 22. So Spirit is looking up to the heavenly city. This city pure is not for thee. Of course, the body will die and be buried on earth. For things unclean there shall not be. So the form of this poem is a debate between flesh and spirit, but it then moves into a kind of vision at the end. And of course, both the debate and the vision are kinds of poetry that were very popular in the medieval times. And these are survivals then in her poetry of very ancient kinds of ways of writing poetry. In a letter she wrote called "To My Dear Children," she puts her own experiences very much in a religious context of having to deal with the difficulties of life. The Puritan or Protestant conviction in the 17th century most certainly was that God's will and intention can be read in everything. So here she says, about 16, that is about the age of 16, the Lord laid his hand sore upon me and smote me with the smallpox. Notice the way that is phrased. Getting a disease like smallpox is God doing it to her. This is what is so difficult for us to grasp from our own 20th century perspective, the way in which the 17th century Puritans saw everything in those terms. Every event that happened was looked upon as, what is God saying? What is God doing? Why is this happening in the divine scheme of things? Then notice the next sentence. When I was in my affliction, I besought the Lord and confessed my pride and vanity, and he was entreated of me and again restored me. And again, she makes the connection that it is her attitude towards him, her compliance, her beseeching him and confessing that has made the difference. And then this next sentence suggests the same sort of connection. And this is what I'm really trying to show here, the way in which events in everyday life were read in a context of a kind of divine providence and plan. After some time, I fell into a lingering sickness like a consumption, together with a lameness, which correction I saw the Lord sent to humble and try me and do me good. The diagnosis of what's happened here is a little difficult. Consumption with a lameness. I suspect this might be a bout of depression. We have to face up to the fact that the coming of these people to the New World was a shock. Here, for instance, is another image. That is the church, St. Botolph's Parish Church in Boston, but not the Boston in the New World. This is in Boston, the town on the east coast of England that Massachusetts Boston is named for. This is the church with a tower of 275 feet that Anne Bradstreet was a member of as a girl. The power of architecture and religion, of course, in England was very great, and coming out to the New World, it must have been a shock to move into basically a cabin in the woods without any of the great tradition. And so something like bouts of depression, probably much more common than we'll ever know. This is an interesting passage also from this letter. Many times hath Satan troubled me concerning the verity of the Scriptures. Many times by atheism, how I could know whether there was a God. I never saw any miracles to confirm me, and those which I read of, how did I know but they were feigned? A very interesting sort of question, and certainly not a question that you find among most of of these Puritans. Here's another passage. If we admit this be the true God whom we worship, and that the Bible be his word, yet why may not the popish religion be the right? Referring to Catholicism. They have the same God, the same Christ, the same word. They only interpret it one way, we another. That's the sort of question that one might expect an intelligent, thinking person of the 20th century to say. You know, we've got these two religions. How do we know ours is right? She goes back to her religion, though not for any doctrinal reasons. She says, but the vain fooleries that are in their religion, probably the rituals which the Puritans wanted to do away with, together with their lying miracles, probably that would refer to, the sort of literalistic interpretation of the changing of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus in the Eucharist. This was something that Protestants generally opposed and threw out of their own system. And cruel persecutions of the saints. Well, of course, she's referring there to the persecutions of the Catholics, by the Catholics against the Puritans. The consideration of these things would soon turn me to my own religion again. Well, we come to Edward Taylor. Born in 1642, he was of a family with one girl and 5 boys. He knew and learned farming as an animal husbandry as a young boy in England, and later as a minister in Westfield, Massachusetts. He was a practicing farmer. He was a very well-educated man. He learned the languages, Greek and Latin and Hebrew. He probably knew the English poets up to his departure from England. He was a nonconformist and a Puritan. He was happy with the Puritan ascendancy in England in the middle part of the century, but with the Restoration in 1660, which ended Puritan power in England, he became dissatisfied, and in 1668 then he departed to the New World. He was given advanced study status at Harvard. He took a degree in 1671, 3 years later, and certainly excelled in his studies, and probably would have settled in Harvard. He was certainly the scholar of his graduating class, but he was asked to come to Westfield, which was about 100 miles west, and he went in December of, let me put this map up again to show you where Westfield is. Here's Massachusetts Bay Colony, and here we have Westfield, about 100 miles inland, very much on the frontier. So he went in December of 1871. 3 years later, he married a woman by the name of Elizabeth Finch. She was the daughter of a Connecticut minister. He courted her very elaborately. He said in writing that although Christ was most in his heart, there was still some space left for her. They had a marriage of 15 years. She bore 8 children. 5 of them died as infants. A good example of the hazards of frontier life without modern medicine. Here is a poem he wrote about the time that one of his children died, upon wedlock and the death of children. A curious knot God made in paradise and drew it out enameled neatly fresh. He's referring, of course, to Adam and Eve in paradise. It was the true love knot, more sweet than spice, and set with all the flowers of grace's dress. It's weddin's knot that ne'er can be untied. No Alexander's sword can it divide. When in this knot I planted was, my stock soon knotted, and a manly flower outbrake, referring to him having a child. And after it my branch again did not, brought out another flower, its sweet-breathed mate. And he goes through the poem talking about each of the children. I think at this time 4 had been born. But oh, a glorious hand from glory came, guarded with angels, soon did crop this flower. One of his children is taken away. And then we get the traditional sort of religious consolation here as he tries to sort through his grief. But pausing on it, this sweet perfumed my thought. Christ would in glory have a flower. That is, Christ in his glory wanted a flower, choice, prime, and having choice, chose this my branch forth brought. And so he says, Lord, take it. I thank thee. Thou takest aught of mine. It is my pledge in glory. Part of me is now in it, Lord, glorified with thee. But, of course, that does not make it easy. The death of children is a difficult thing to deal with. But, oh, the tortures, vomits, screechings, groans, and 6 weeks' fever would pierce hearts like stones. Grief o'er doth flow, and nature fault would find, were not thy will my spell, charm, joy, and gem. That as I said, I say, take, Lord, they're thine. I piecemeal pass to glory bright in them. I joy, may I sweet flowers for glory breed, whether thou getst them green or letst them seed. So there's a sort of traditional answer here that ultimately these are God's children, and whether God gets them when they're green, that is, they die in childbirth, or lets them seed, lets them grow up and become adults, and then gets them later. It doesn't matter. He's willing to give them. Edward Taylor has a much stronger sort of theological approach to these things than Anne Bradstreet. After 15 years of marriage, 8 children, Elizabeth Finch died in 1689. He wrote an elegy expressing his grief, which includes a memorable line, "She was a neat, good housewife every inch." He had troubles in this colony. There was King Philip's War for 4 years. It took several years before they could get the church properly established, but he actually organized the church in the late 1679s, the first church in Westfield. He married again to Ruth Willis. She was from Hartford, Connecticut, which on the map, if you can imagine, is just a few miles to the south in Connecticut. And she was by his side for the next 37 years. She not only raised his 3 surviving children, but she bore 6 more. He had a total of 14 children. Here is a summary of his major publications. The diary is really a short-term thing that he kept from the time he departed from New England until he graduated from Harvard, but it's very interesting, the account of his voyage across the Atlantic. In 1680, he published God's Determinations Touching His Elect. This is a long exposition of covenant theology in poetry, brilliantly presented. Edward Taylor had a real gift for presenting abstract thought in art. Great imagination, and a lot of technical skill. His major work, however, must be the preparatory meditations. Every 2 months, 6 times a year, Taylor had to administer the Mass. And in each case, he went through a spiritual preparation, wrote a sermon, and part of that spiritual preparation was to write a poem. 6 a year. He did this over a third of a century. Over 200 poems in the preparatory meditations. He bound them all together in a leather-bound book. And when he died in 1729, they were left to his grandson, Ezra Stiles. They were kept in the family, and eventually in 1883, Edward Taylor's great-grandson, Henry Taylor, deposited this leather-bound manuscript in the Yale University Library. In 1937, Thomas Johnson located and published these, and for the first time, 200 years after his death, we became aware of Edward Taylor. Here's a sample of his handwriting. Very difficult to read. This says inquiry on this. What is a type? This is referring to typology. Here's the prologue to his preparatory meditations. Lord, can a crumb of dust the earth outweigh, outmatch all mountains? Nay, the crystal sky, embosom in it designs that shall display and trace into the boundless deity? I am this crumb of dust. The paradox of can a mind that is part of the universe somehow comprehend the universe? Can a mind that is so limited compared to God possibly comprehend? Inspire this crumb of dust till it display thy glory through it, and then thy dust shall live. That captures very much the spirit of the preparatory meditations. He's asking for inspiration. The Puritans were incredibly pious in everything they did. They insisted on being prepared religiously. To prove thou art, and that thou art the best, and show thy properties to shine most bright, and when thy works will shine as flowers on stems, or as in jewelry shops do gems. Notice the very homely, sort of earthy imagery here, jewelry shops and gems, flowers on stems. Here is meditation 8. Each of his meditations was based on a biblical verse. This one is from the Gospel of John 6:51. I am the living bread, which of course were words spoken by Jesus. Here is an interesting, this is the second stanza, where he talks about man, soul, as a bird of paradise caught in a wicker cage. When that this bird of paradise put in this wicker cage, my body, to tweedle praise, had pecked the fruit for bad, and so did fling away its food, and lost its golden days, it fell into celestial famine sore, and never could attain a morsel more. That's the story of the soul in the world, starved because it cut off its source of food. And the poem then uses the bread of life, and here are some of the images, versions of bread of life that come up in the poem. Soul bread, world's white loaf, purest wheat in heaven, bread of life, God's white loaf, heaven's sugar cake, a startling, a really quite startling image. Well, characteristics of Edward Taylor: he was a very careful craftsman, constantly revised his poems. The metrics of his poems, the stanzaic qualities, the numbers of feet in the lines is rarely fudged. It's virtually perfect. He's a very, very careful worker always. And he was, however, limited in subject matter, very little on family and so on. That one poem about the death of his children is an exception, really. Mostly his poems were about the relation between God and man. He wrote very vividly, full of sensuous imagery. He uses very homely, sometimes rural comparisons. Sin, for instance, is a spider's bite that makes one swell up so much one can't fit through heaven's gates. The soul is like a thicket that needs to be cleared. Angels are sometimes seen as waiters, and God is seen as a master craftsman. Very innovative. And some of his innovations come because he had no real audience. He wasn't writing to be published or read. He had no editors to satisfy, and so his diction was often quite unconfined. He invented words, and occasionally you come across some really striking, almost startling phrases. He very surprising in his inventiveness. Sometimes, in fact, his poetry is a little rough because it was never tested against an oral reading. It was not meant to be read aloud. Sometimes that comes across in the poetry, and you feel that it's quite rough. Upon a Spider Catching a Fly is a poem that's interesting to look at. A very simple moral instruction. A spider spins a web. If he catches a fly, he bites it dead. If he catches a wasp, he is much more cautious because the wasp is dangerous. And the moral lesson seems to side with the wasp. Hell's spider is out there seeking to tangle us in his web. We, like the wasp, must resist. And God will send his grace to help us break the cord of the web. Probably the most influential book in New England was the New England Primer. I put the dates there, 1683 to 1830. It was first published in 1683, and the New England Primer was used in schools to teach children their alphabet up until 1830, which, as you can calculate, is a century and a half. And in that time, the New England Primer was probably sold about 5 million copies. Everything in learning language was connected with religion. Letter A, in Adam's fall we sinned all. B, thy life to mend this book attend. And C, the cat doth play, and after slay. A dog will bite a thief at night. An eagle's flight is out of sight. The idle fool is whipped at school. And notice the preponderance of religion in these. These are little woodcuts, illustrations in the New England Primer. Peter denies his Lord and cries. You have the cock that crowed 3 times there. Queen Esther comes in royal state to save the Jews from dismal fate. Rachel, I can't make that out, what that says. Then for slightly advanced children, an alphabet of lessons for youth. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. B, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. And C, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. You can see how the learning of the alphabet progresses from the little tiny verses up to these longer sentences. And then finally, the last half of the New England Primer is the shorter catechism, which is the Westminster Catechism that was universally accepted by the Puritans. And there you can see the opening famous question, what is the chief end of man? The answer, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Of course, there was no separate children's literature. Children read things that parents wanted them to read, and it was all directed to moral instruction, as the New England Primer, I think, very nicely illustrates. Well, have a good day.